I want to tell you about the day I walked out of hell wearing my Sunday dress and carrying nothing but my dignity. People think courage is something you're born with, but I learned it at 40 years old, standing in a church basement with pie filling on my dress and 24 years of silence finally breaking open in my throat. My name is Dorothy Walsh, though most folks call me Dot. I'm 82 years old now, and I'm sitting here in my sewing studio surrounded by bolts of fabric in every color you can imagine: crimson silks, navy wools, buttercup cottons. My fingers aren't as nimble as they used to be, bent a bit from decades of pushing needles through stubborn cloth, but they still remember. They remember everything. Behind me on the wall hangs a black and white photograph from 1959. The girl in that picture is 16 years old, wearing a borrowed white dress, her eyes swollen from crying. That girl was me, on what should have been the happiest day of a young woman's life. It was spring of 1959, and I was supposed to be finishing my junior year at St. Catherine's High School. I had sketchbooks filled with dress designs, full skirts with crinolines, fitted bodices with princess seams, elegant evening gowns I'd seen in my mother's old magazines. My home economics teacher, Mrs. Patterson, said I had real talent, that maybe I could apply to the Fashion Institute in New York City. I'd lie awake at night imagining myself in a proper design studio, creating beautiful things that would make women feel special. But my father, God rest his soul, had a weakness for poker and racetrack betting. By the time spring came that year, he owed serious money to Jimmy Walsh, a man who ran a construction business and had his fingers in half the businesses in our neighborhood. The kind of man you didn't want to owe money to. I remember the night my father came home and called a family meeting. My mother's hands were shaking as she poured coffee. My two younger brothers were sent upstairs, and my father, who couldn't look me in the eye, told me I was getting married. Jimmy Walsh's son, Frank, he said, his voice flat. Good Catholic boy. 24 years old, has a steady job working for his father. The wedding's in 3 weeks. I thought it was a joke at first. Then I saw my mother's face, pale, defeated, tears streaming down her cheeks, but making no sound. She'd already known. They'd already decided. Papa, I'm 16, I whispered. I have 2 more years of school. I want to... This is what's happening, Dorothy, he cut me off. Jimmy's agreed to forgive the debt. It's done. My mother came to my room that night. She sat on the edge of my narrow bed and stroked my hair like she used to when I was little. I'm so sorry, baby, she said, but this is how the world works. Women, we survive. We endure. You'll learn. 3 weeks later, I stood in St. Bartholomew's Church in a white dress borrowed from my cousin Marie. It was too big across the shoulders, too tight at the waist. My mother had tried to fix it, but her hands shook too much to sew straight seams. I cried so hard that morning that my face was blotchy and swollen, my eyes nearly swollen shut. My mother tried to fix my makeup 3 times, but the tears kept coming. Frank Walsh stood at the altar looking uncomfortable in his suit. He was a tall man, thin, with dark hair slicked back with too much pomade. He didn't look cruel. He looked empty, like a man going through motions he didn't choose either. When Father O'Brien asked if I took this man to be my husband, my voice cracked on "I do." It sounded like a question. The reception was held in the church basement. I barely touched the food. People toasted us with cheap champagne. My father got drunk and jovial. his debt erased, his conscience apparently clear. My mother sat in the corner looking like she'd aged 10 years overnight. It was at that reception that I met her, Beatrice Walsh. She was a tall woman, rigid as an ironing board, with iron-gray hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She wore black, always black, and had eyes like chips of ice. She approached me while I was sitting alone at the bride's table, picking at a piece of wedding cake I had no appetite for. "So you're the girl," she said, looking me up and down like I was a cut of meat at the butcher's. "Young. That's good. You'll be easier to train." I didn't understand what she meant then. God help me, I would learn. Frank and I moved into the Walsh family home, a large, dark Victorian house on Maple Street that always smelled of boiled cabbage and furniture polish. Beatrice Walsh ruled that house like a general commanding troops. Her husband, Jimmy, was loud and brash in public, but at home he was a mouse. Frank was even worse, a grown man of 24 who still asked his mother's permission for everything. My first morning as Mrs. Frank Walsh, I woke up at 7 o'clock, thinking that was a reasonable time. Beatrice was standing at the foot of the bed, still as a statue, waiting. "In this house," she said, her voice cold and level, "the women rise at 5. There's breakfast to prepare, floors to wash, laundry to scrub. Your husband leaves for work at 6:30, and his breakfast must be ready at 6. Tomorrow morning, I expect you downstairs at 5 o'clock sharp. Do you understand?" I nodded, too frightened to speak. "I asked you a question, girl." "Yes," I whispered. "Yes, I understand." "Yes, what?" "Yes, ma'am." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Good. You can learn. Now get dressed and come downstairs. There's work to do." That became my life. Every morning at 5, I'd drag myself out of bed in the dark and make my way down to that freezing kitchen. I'd make breakfast: eggs, bacon, toast, coffee, and oatmeal. Beatrice had exact specifications for everything. The eggs had to be soft-boiled for exactly 3.5 minutes. No more, no less. The bacon had to be crispy, but not burned. The toast had to be golden brown on both sides, buttered while still hot. The first time I got the eggs wrong, 4 minutes instead of 3.5, she picked up the plate and smashed it on the floor. Yolk and shell splattered across the clean linoleum I'd mopped the night before. "Again," she said simply. I made them again, hands shaking. This time they were right. After breakfast, there was the rest of the house to clean. Beatrice had a white glove she'd run along window sills, baseboards, picture frames. If her glove came back with even a trace of dust, I'd have to clean that entire room again. She checked the corners of the bathroom with a magnifying glass. She inspected the laundry line to make sure the sheets were hung evenly, with precisely 6 inches between each clothespin. I was allowed to eat lunch at noon, leftovers from breakfast usually, eaten standing up in the kitchen. Then there was more cleaning, or ironing, or mending. Beatrice had a basket of Frank's socks that always needed darning, Jimmy's shirts that needed buttons replaced, her own undergarments that needed careful hand-washing. Dinner had to be ready at exactly 6 o'clock. The table had to be set with the good china, the glasses polished until they sparkled, the napkins folded in perfect triangles. Beatrice would inspect everything before the men came to the table. If anything was wrong, dinner would be delayed while I fixed it, and Frank and Jimmy would sit there hungry and irritable. and somehow that was my fault too. The worst part wasn't the work, though the work was endless and exhausting. The worst part was the isolation. 3 months after the wedding, my mother called the house, asking if she could visit, if I could come home for Sunday dinner. Beatrice answered the phone. "Dorothy is a Walsh now," I heard her say from the kitchen, where I was scrubbing the floor on my hands and knees. "She has responsibilities here. Perhaps in a few months, when she's properly settled." She hung up without asking me. When I asked if I could call my mother back, she said no. "You spend too much time feeling sorry for yourself," Beatrice said. "Your parents sold you to pay a debt. They don't want you anymore. The sooner you accept that, the better." Frank was sitting right there, reading the newspaper. He didn't say a word in my defense. He never did. As time went on, Beatrice's rules became more elaborate. I wasn't allowed to receive mail without her reading it first. I couldn't leave the house without her permission. I wasn't allowed to have friends over. The only place I was permitted to go alone was to church on Sunday mornings. And even then, Beatrice would time me. If I took more than 2 hours, I'd be questioned about where I'd been, what I'd been doing, who I'd been talking to. I tried to talk to Frank about it, lying beside him in the dark. "Your mother is very strict," I whispered one night. "Maybe we could get our own apartment? Just the two of us?" He rolled over to face the wall. "Don't be ridiculous, Dorothy. This is my family's house. This is where we belong. But I'm your wife, and she's my mother. She knows what's best. You're young. You'll understand when you're older. Now go to sleep." That's how it always went. Frank wasn't cruel to me directly. He wasn't violent. He didn't yell. But he was worse than cruel. He was nothing. A void where a partner should have been. He took his mother's side in everything. Or more often, he simply said nothing at all. I got pregnant in the fall of 1960. I was 17 years old. I knew something was wrong when I missed my monthly cycle. I felt sick every morning, but I still had to be downstairs at 5, still had to cook those perfect eggs while trying not to vomit from the smell of bacon grease. I told Frank after a few weeks. He told his mother. Beatrice's response was to work me harder. "Pregnancy isn't an illness," she said. "My mother worked in the fields until the day she gave birth to me. You can certainly manage some light housework." Light housework. I was on my feet 14 hours a day, scrubbing floors, carrying heavy baskets of wet laundry, reaching up to wash windows. When I suggested maybe seeing a doctor, Beatrice laughed. "Doctors are for women who can't handle what's natural," she said. "Walsh women have our babies at home. I'll call the midwife when your time comes." I was terrified. I'd heard stories from my mother about women who died in childbirth, babies who didn't survive. But I had no money of my own. Beatrice controlled every penny in that house. I couldn't even afford to make a phone call without asking for a dime. My pregnancy was lonely and frightening. Beatrice criticized everything: my posture, the way I carried the weight, how much I ate. "You're eating for 2, not for 10, she'd say when I reached for a second helping at dinner. Meanwhile, I was expected to maintain all my regular duties. My labor started on a hot June afternoon in 1961. I was hanging laundry in the backyard when the first contraction hit. It felt like someone had wrapped a belt around my middle and was tightening it until I couldn't breathe. I made it back to the house and found Beatrice in the kitchen. "It's time," I gasped. She looked at the clock. "Dinner isn't for another 2 hours. Get the roast in the oven first." I stared at her, doubled over in pain. "But do it now, Dorothy. The baby isn't coming this second." Somehow, with contractions coming every 15 minutes, I got that roast in the oven. Then Beatrice allowed me to go upstairs to the bedroom. She called the midwife, a stern old woman named Mrs. Kowalski, who smelled of camphor and whiskey. My labor lasted 18 hours. 18 hours of pain like nothing I'd ever imagined. Mrs. Kowalski was efficient but not particularly kind. Beatrice sat in a chair in the corner, watching, offering no comfort. At one point, when I was screaming through a contraction, she said, "Control yourself. You're acting like an animal." Frank stayed downstairs the entire time. I could hear the television playing. When Timothy finally came, just after dawn, I hemorrhaged. I remember seeing blood, so much blood, soaking through the sheets, pooling on the mattress. Mrs. Kowalski's face went white. She was shouting at Beatrice to call an ambulance, to get towels, to do something. Beatrice stood up slowly from her chair. She looked at me bleeding on the bed, looked at my newborn son crying in Mrs. Kowalski's arms, and said, "I hope the next one is a girl. We have enough boys in this family." Then she left the room. Mrs. Kowalski saved my life. She packed me with towels and ice, elevated my legs, and somehow stopped the bleeding. When the ambulance finally arrived, called by Mrs. Kowalski herself, I was barely conscious. I spent 3 days in the hospital. Beatrice visited once, for 15 minutes, to tell me that Timothy was fine and that I'd need to be more careful next time. I came home weak and traumatized. I'd lost so much blood that I could barely walk up the stairs. The doctor said I needed bed rest for at least 2 weeks. Beatrice gave me 3 days. On the 4th day, she woke me at 5 in the morning with the baby crying in his basket. "He needs feeding," she said. "And there's breakfast to make." Those early years of Timothy's life blur together in my memory. I was so exhausted, so worn down, that I moved through each day like a ghost. I loved my son desperately. His tiny fingers, his sweet baby smell, the way he smiled when he saw me. But I was too broken to enjoy motherhood the way I should have. Beatrice criticized my parenting constantly. I held him too much. I didn't hold him enough. I fed him too often. I wasn't feeding him enough. His diapers weren't changed fast enough. His clothes weren't pressed properly. Nothing I did was right, and Frank remained useless. He'd come home from work, kiss his mother's cheek, pat Timothy's head, and ask what was for dinner. He never asked how I was. He never noticed that I'd lost weight until my dresses hung on me like scarecrow clothes. He never saw the bruises on my knees from scrubbing floors, or the burns on my hands from the iron, or the permanent exhaustion in my eyes. The years passed. Timothy grew. I grew older. The girl who'd dreamed of designing beautiful dresses faded away, replaced by a hollow woman who knew how to cook eggs for exactly 3.5 minutes and fold napkins into perfect triangles. I stopped seeing my family almost entirely. The few times my mother managed to visit, Beatrice would hover, making everyone uncomfortable until they left. My brothers got married and moved away. My father died in 1968, and I barely had time to grieve before Beatrice had me back in the kitchen preparing dinner for the wake. I thought about leaving sometimes. Late at night, lying next to Frank's sleeping form, I'd imagine walking out the door with Timothy in my arms. But where would I go? I had no money, no job skills beyond housework. The church taught that divorce was a mortal sin. My own mother had told me to endure. This was just how life was for women like us. But something changed as the 1970s arrived. The world outside that dark house was changing. I'd catch glimpses on the television. Women marching, women working in offices, women demanding to be heard. Timothy was getting older, watching me, and I started to wonder what I was teaching him about how men should treat women. The breaking point came in November of 1979. I was 40 years old. The church was hosting a Thanksgiving potluck dinner, and I'd spent all day making my grandmother's apple pie. The one thing I made that people actually complimented. It had a lattice crust that took hours to weave, and I'd gotten up at 3 a.m. to make sure it was perfect. We brought it to the church basement that evening. Everyone was setting their dishes on the long tables, casseroles and hams and rolls and desserts. I set my pie down carefully next to a chocolate cake. Beatrice came up behind me. She looked at my pie, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. It was beautiful, and she knew it, and she couldn't stand that I'd made something beautiful. She picked it up. For a second, I thought she was going to examine it more closely. Instead, she turned to the crowd of women standing nearby and said loudly, "Would you look at this pie Dorothy made? The crust is so thick and tough, my dog wouldn't eat it. I keep trying to teach her, but some people just don't have the talent for baking." The room went quiet. Women I'd known for years looked away, embarrassed. A few laughed nervously. Beatrice set the pie back down on the table and walked away. I stood there, looking at that pie I'd worked so hard on, feeling 24 years of humiliation crash over me like a wave. Every cruel word, every impossible standard, every moment of being treated like I was worthless, it all came flooding back. And something in me snapped. I picked up the pie. I walked across the room to where Beatrice was standing talking to Father Donnelly, and I said clearly and calmly, "Beatrice, I've spent 24 years trying to please you. I've cooked your eggs exactly 3.5 minutes. I've scrubbed your floors until my knees bled. I've let you control every aspect of my life. But I'm done. I'm finished." She turned to me, her face already hardening into that familiar look of cold fury. "Dorothy, you're making a scene." "Yes," I interrupted her. "I am. For the first time in my life, I'm making a scene. And here's what I want everyone here to know. You're a cruel, controlling woman who's made my life hell since I was 16 years old. You're the reason your son is a coward who can't stand up to his own mother, and I'm leaving." I set the pie down on the table in front of her. Pie fillings slopped over the edge onto the white tablecloth. Then I turned and walked out of that church basement. I walked out into the November night, wearing just my Sunday dress and the cardigan I'd knitted myself. I walked home, to that dark house that had never been home, and I went straight upstairs to Timothy's room. He was 18 then, a tall, quiet young man who'd grown up watching me shrink. He looked up from his homework when I opened the door. "Pack a bag," I told him. "We're leaving." "Mom?" He looked confused, scared even. "Your father and grandmother have made me feel small for 24 years, I said. "I won't do it anymore. I'm leaving this house, and I'm asking you to come with me. But if you choose to stay, I understand." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he got up and started packing. We left that night with 2 suitcases between us. We walked to my friend Margaret's house, a woman I'd known from church who'd always been kind to me. She opened her door at 10 o'clock at night, took one look at my face, and said, "Come in." We stayed on Margaret's couch for 3 weeks. Frank called twice, both times asking when I was coming home, saying his mother was very upset. He never once asked how I was, or said he missed me, or apologized. On the second call, I told him I wanted a divorce. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then, "You can't be serious." "We're Catholics, Dorothy. People will talk." "Let them talk," I said, and hung up. The divorce took 2 years. Frank fought it, or rather, Beatrice fought it through him. The church condemned me. People I'd known for decades crossed the street to avoid speaking to me. I was called a bad mother, a bad wife, a woman who'd abandoned her sacred vows. But Margaret stood by me. And slowly, a few other women did too. Women who'd seen what I'd lived through, who'd been silent out of their own fear, but who found courage in my choice. I needed money, I needed work, and the only skill I had, the only thing that was truly mine, was sewing. I started small. I'd alter clothes for people, take up hems, replace zippers, fix torn seams. I charged almost nothing at first, just enough to contribute to Margaret's household and save a tiny bit. I worked at Margaret's kitchen table with her old sewing machine, the same one her mother had used. My hands remembered things my mind had forgotten. The feel of fabric, the tension of thread, the satisfaction of a perfect seam. As I worked, something inside me began to wake up. That 16-year-old girl with sketchbooks full of dreams. Timothy got a job at a garage, working on cars. He was quiet about the whole thing, never blamed me, never asked to go back to his father's house. One night, about 6 months after we'd left, he came home with his paycheck and handed me half of it. "For when you get your own shop," he said. I cried. After all those years of not crying, I finally did. Slowly, my little alteration business grew. Women started asking if I could make them dresses, not just fix their old ones. I said yes, even though I hadn't made a garment from scratch in over 20 years. I stayed up late studying patterns, relearning techniques, teaching myself new skills. In 1982, 3 years after I walked out of that church basement, I rented a tiny storefront on Oak Street. It was barely bigger than a closet, with one window and temperamental heating, but it was mine. I hung a sign in the window, "Dot's Custom Sewing." The first few years were hard. Money was tight. There were weeks when I lived on canned soup and crackers so I could pay the rent. But I was happy, truly happy, for the first time since I was 16 years old. I specialized in wedding dresses. I know that might seem strange, given my own marriage, but I loved making them. I loved taking a bolt of white silk or satin and transforming it into something beautiful, something that would make a young woman feel special on her wedding day. Every bride who came to my shop, I'd ask her, "Is this what you want? Are you marrying him because you choose to, or because someone is choosing for you?" More than once, a young woman would start crying and admit she wasn't sure. I'd make her tea, I'd listen, and I'd tell her gently that it was okay to say no, that saying no was sometimes the bravest thing you could do. Timothy met a wonderful girl named Sarah when he was 23. She was kind and funny and strong, and the first time he brought her to meet me, I knew he'd chosen well. When they got engaged, Sarah asked if I would make her wedding dress. I made her the most beautiful gown I'd ever created, fitted bodice, full skirt with layers of tulle, delicate beading on the sleeves. She cried when she tried it on. They got married in a small ceremony in 1987. Frank came. I saw him across the church, older, thinner, still looking like a man who'd let life happen to him rather than choosing it for himself. He nodded at me. I nodded back. That was all. Beatrice didn't come. I heard she was ill, though she'd lived for many more years. Part of me felt nothing about her absence. Part of me felt relieved. And a tiny part of me felt something like pity for a woman so consumed by the need to control others that she'd driven away her own son's love. My business grew. I hired 2 seamstresses to help me, then 4. We moved to a bigger shop with better lighting and more space. I started teaching sewing classes on Saturday mornings, and women of all ages would come. Teenagers learning to make their own clothes, older women wanting to learn a new skill, mothers teaching their daughters. Timothy and Sarah gave me 3 granddaughters, beautiful, smart, fierce girls who grew up knowing their grandmother wasn't just someone who baked cookies and knitted scarves. I taught each of them to sew. I told them my story, not to scare them, but to show them that you're never too old to start over, that you're never too far gone to reclaim yourself. Last year, in October of 2024, I got a phone call. Beatrice had died at the age of 103. Frank asked if I would come to the funeral. I almost said no. Part of me wanted to let that chapter stay closed, but another part of me, the part that had walked out of that church basement 45 years ago, knew I needed to go. Not for her, for me. The funeral was small. Frank looked old and tired. A few relatives I barely remembered. I sat in the back pew and listened to the priest talk about Beatrice's dedication to her family, her strong faith, her devotion to tradition. I didn't cry. I felt nothing but a quiet sense of finality. At the cemetery, I stood at the edge of her grave. Frank came and stood beside me. "I should have stood up for you," he said quietly. "I was a coward." I looked at him. "Yes," I said. "You were." He nodded. "I know. I'm sorry." "I forgive you," I told him, and realized I meant it, not for his sake, but for mine. I was tired of carrying anger. As I walked away from that grave, I felt something lift from my shoulders. That scared 16-year-old girl, the one who'd cried on her wedding day, the one who'd spent 24 years trying to be good enough, she was finally at peace. I'd carried her for so long, and now I could let her rest. I'm 82 years old now. My studio is full of color and light, and the sound of sewing machines humming. My granddaughters visit me often. The oldest, Emma, is studying fashion design in New York City, following the dream I'd once had. She calls me every Sunday and tells me about her classes, her designs, her plans. Last week she asked me, "Grandma Dot, do you regret all those years, all that time you lost?" I thought about it carefully before answering. "I regret that it happened," I told her. "I regret that I was forced into that situation, that I suffered, that I let fear keep me trapped for so long. But I don't regret who I became because of it. I don't regret the strength I found, even if I found it later than I should have. The truth is, My life didn't really begin until I was 40 years old, until I stood up in that church basement and said no, until I walked out with nothing but my dignity and my son beside me. People think you have to be young to start over, to chase dreams, to become who you were meant to be. But I'm living proof that's not true. Age is just a number. It's never too late to say no to people who diminish you. It's never too late to say yes to yourself. These hands of mine, bent and spotted with age, marked by decades of needles and thread, they've created beautiful things. They've built a life from nothing. They've held my granddaughters and taught them to be strong. They've sewn wedding dresses for women who chose their own happiness. And they've never, not once, had to cook eggs for exactly 3.5 minutes again. If I could go back and talk to that 16-year-old girl in the borrowed wedding dress, I'd tell her, "This will hurt. It will hurt for a long time. But you're stronger than you know. And one day, you'll walk into the light, and you'll be free, and you'll make beautiful things, and you'll be happy. Hold on. Just hold on." That's my story. It's not a fairy tale. It doesn't have a perfect ending. But it's mine, and I survived it, and I'm proud of that. I'm proud of the woman I became when I finally gave myself permission to become her. Never let anyone make you small. Never let anyone convince you that their cruelty is just the way things are. And remember, it's never ever too late to start living the life you were meant to live.